Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare is one of my favourite games, but one that's often overlooked when compared to its survival horror origins, with the original game being one of the forefathers of horror, and the more recent entries in the series being more action-oriented. The New Nightmare presents the story of Edward Carnby and Aline Cedric as they travel to Shadow Island and try to figure out what really happened there. But before the events of the game is the deep history retold in the game's numerous diary entries and books. They retell the surprisingly complex stories of the generations of Morton family that lived on the island, with it going all the way back to the 1800s, and it's a really interesting read, and I've decided to try and do a retelling of the events. The game has various contradictions in its diary entries, and it's made making this video pretty hard, and I'll point out where some things don't make sense and talk about it as time goes on. The Morton family roots were in Sussex, England, before moving to America at the time of the 1800s. The family history book you can find in the Morton Library states that Robert Morton, who was a linen merchant, led his family to America and built a paper mill in 1823. But it says that Richard Morton, who was his older brother, created an oil company in 1889. This is the first inconsistency because it says on the final page of the history book that Richard Morton was born in 1852, which makes it impossible to be Robert's older brother if he was born 30 years after Robert founded a paper mill. There are little things like this throughout the story that make it a little difficult to understand. However, it's safe to assume that instead of older brother, Robert was probably supposed to be Richard's father. Robert isn't mentioned besides this one brief bit of text, but Richard, however, is a deeply interesting character. Richard's oil company was doing well, plundering the natural resources of Venezuela. The growth of his company was exponential, with it quickly propelling Richard Morton into wealth. And thanks to this wealth, he began going on various expeditions for his oil company, which eventually led him to Greenland. After venturing to the cold land of Greenland, underneath the ice, Richard and his fellow explorers found the frozen remains of a man, and with him a tablet of which language he could not decipher. Whilst we know what he found, we don't really know what caused the effects that this had on him. It seemed to have left an everlasting mark on his mind that led him down a path of reclusion, backing away from the parties and high society events that he was often found at, instead sending him off on various expeditions that, whether he wanted to or not, led him back to Greenland and the Iceman. On these expeditions was a mercenary called Judas Deserto, who after several missions with Richard, wrote him a letter promising power and fortune in exchange for a small vial of blood. Deserto did more than dabble in black magic, and after receiving the vial from Richard Morton, true to his word, Deserto delivered his promises. Richard Morton's company prospered at the cost of his competitors, who struck disaster after disaster, ranging from sudden accidents to prominent figures in their companies suddenly developing mental disorders. Their lawyers would suddenly cave in and agree to deals that were of little to no benefit, and the unnatural frequency to these events pointed the finger at Deserto. But nobody could prove anything. Everyone involved knew it was unnatural, but they had no proof. Despite this wealth and fame, something still haunted Richard Morton. Unable to let go of what he found in Greenland, he hired a young man named Samuel Gibson to translate the tablets in 1899. Gibson had a talent for ancient languages, and after a while he found a similarity between the tablet found with the Iceman and some engravings in the basement on the fort of Shadow Island, a derelict, abandoned island off the coast of Maine. The fort was one of the many that had been made by the ancient tribe of Native Americans called the Abcanis, and to keep in proximity to this fort, Richard Morton had a mansion built on the island. The mansion was incredibly spacious with numerous rooms, studies, and a large library that Richard took pride in, whereas the fort had been used during the war but had been abandoned for years as the soldiers who were stationed there would experience hallucinations and suffered from sudden psychosis, whilst others just simply vanished. During the twilight years of his life, Richard Morton's relations with Gibson broke down as Gibson found himself more and more alarmed by the things he was translating from the Abcanis tablets, and Richard Morton was increasingly obsessed with finding out more and delving deeper into the pits below Shadow Island. Gibson would write letters of his concerned feelings to his fiancée on the mainland before one day completely vanishing. After Gibson's disappearance, Richard Morton wrote a letter to Gibson's mother that simply said, "Your son has disappeared, his body has not been found, My condolences. In 2001, when the game takes place, you can find Gibson chained to Richard Morton's tomb with a letter he wrote cursing the Morton family. In 1903, Richard Morton reached rock bottom when he and Deserto kidnapped young women from poor neighborhoods to sacrifice them in disturbing black magic rituals that continued until he died in 1905, when the abductions suddenly stopped. His will can be found in the game, where he directly writes to his son, in which he details his lack of respect for humanity, humanity's achievements, and says that the glory will belong to his son, who will surpass him, going further than he ever did. In 1874, Richard had a son called Archibald that continued the Morton trend of expeditions to the polar caps and barbaric rituals, but instead of kidnapping girls from the mainland, Archibald would travel to Polynesia and abduct a boatload of people at a time and subject them to the same experiments and rituals that Deserto and his father conducted. He was in contact with slave traders to fulfill the need for people to use and abuse in his obsessive experiments. No trace of these people was ever found on Shadow Island. Archibald isn't mentioned much in the game, but is referred to as Archibald the Bloodthirsty by his own son. One thing that's known about him is the uncommon cruelty in which he treated his wife. She wrote many long letters to her father complaining about the way she was treated by Archibald, but none of the letters ever reached him, since her father had mysteriously vanished the day after her wedding. The letters she sent were found still sealed in the postal archives. Archibald is famous in the game for one claim. He was the first to open the gates underneath Shadow Island and travel into the world of darkness. It's revealed by the tablets that underneath Shadow Island is a gate that, if opened, would allow the creatures of darkness who were trapped down there by the Abcanis to spill out over the world. Traveling into them, Archibald found a series of unholy caves punctuated by fortresses of the Abcanis, whose goal it was to prevent the creatures from ever leaving the caves. His final diary entry can be found next to his battered body. When he died is unknown, but you can assume it was in the early 1900s. He fought his way to the underground caverns filled with monsters, and at some point, something broke his leg, sealing his fate. His final diary entry that you can find next to him states that Deserto abandoned him, and he still sometimes dreamt of the people he sacrificed to the creatures of darkness, that he can see the fear in their eyes as he left them to die. And as he dies, he writes to his father, asking if what he did was for the good of humanity. He recalls an Abcanis carving he read that provided him with a warning that he clearly ignored, telling him that the combat against the darkness was infinite. And the last thing in his diary entry is him professing his love for the creatures that surely killed him. Despite Archibald's attitude towards his wife Jennifer, they had a son. In 1899, Jeremy Morton is born. Unlike his father and grandfather, Jeremy is exceptionally intelligent and shows from a young age a fascination with science. As he grew up, he realized what Deserto was doing to his family and elected to befriend a Native American named Edenshaw. It's unclear how Deserto was defeated, but one of Jeremy Morton's diary entries states that Edenshaw somehow defeated him. Not that this was the end of Deserto, not by a long shot. Free from Deserto's influence, Jeremy Morton would go on to create many fascinating inventions and discoveries that you can find in the game, from the movie camera that works off crystal prisms and light, to the several advanced weapons, from flamethrowers that emit plasma and a gun that shoots arcs of electricity. And for a lot of his early life, he seems to reject the destiny set out for him by his father and grandfather, choosing science over rituals. He seals away the gates of darkness opened by his father, but can't stop the curiosity. There's something down there he doesn't understand and is too enticing to leave alone. After an era of relative peace, he decides he can no longer reject what he is. There's a bit of a divide in the diary entries. When his grandson Allan is born, he shows a genuine fear that Allan is more in tune with the world of darkness, and he does his best to restrict access to his grandson in fear of what he might do. He feels that Shadow Island is his cross to bear, and as time goes on, his friendship with Edenshaw deteriorates, as he realizes that Edenshaw is the last surviving member of the Abcanis tribe. What soured the friendship is recalled in one of Jeremy's diary entries, where he recounts how Edenshaw told him about a dream he had where he describes some statues, perfectly describing statues that Richard Morton and DeSerto found in the caves below Shadow Island, statues that Jeremy had been hiding all this time. Eventually, Edenshaw finds out about them and feels betrayed when he finds that Jeremy knew about the statues all along and concealed knowledge of them. Jeremy states his fear that Edenshaw would destroy the world of darkness, the cause of his growing obsession. He laments in one of his diary entries that his life work has been on the creatures of darkness, and in his old age he's unsure what to do. If he gives the statues to Edenshaw, then Edenshaw will complete this ritual he's read about in the Abcanis tablets. The ritual of his people that, once set in motion, would destroy the world of darkness. But if Jeremy destroys the statues or does nothing, allowing Allan to get hold of them, then the ritual will never be completed and humanity will be at risk of a war against creatures they cannot defeat. In a fit of rage, he tries to destroy the statues, but a bolt of lightning strikes him, leaving him unconscious. He realizes that he either has to give the statues to Edenshaw or let them fall into the hands of Allan, and shows considerable remorse in one of his diary entries that he decides to leave it up to fate. There are 7 statues and he has 4. He gives 1 statue to Allan and hides 3 of them. The others that he doesn't have were concealed by DeSerto's magic and lie somewhere on the island. In 1973, Allan reveals to Jeremy that his plan is to combine the creatures of darkness with humanity to remove the divide and restore unification. Jeremy is horrified and realizes he is too weak and old to oppose his grandson, but in a final letter to him he writes that he's leaving the choice of what to do to Allan, leaving him with a single statue and the task of translating the Abcanis tablets. This always seemed a little odd, since around the same time as his death he's both horrified and frightened of his grandson, but still decides to leave the fate of humanity in his hands. Jeremy Morton passes away in 1973, leaving things hanging in the balance. Jeremy Morton had a son, but it's unclear in the game who he had it with. Regardless, Howard Morton was born in 1931 and is probably talked about the least in the game. He's generally regarded as the least Morton-like Morton, wanting nothing to do with the world of darkness at all, and doing his best to seal it away and prevent his 2 sons, Allan and Obed, from falling into its trap. However, their exposure seems to be inevitable. At Howard's wedding ceremony to Lucy Dogan that took place on the island, a guest wandered off and was found horrifically mutilated by the other guests. And at the age of 10, Allan recalls an event where a creature lunged at his mother while she was riding a horse, causing the horse to rear up, an event that left her crippled and blind. After these events, Howard wants to move off Shadow Island with his wife and children, but Allan refuses. Howard did everything in his power to stop his son Allan, but all that's ever explained in the game is that at some point, Allan killed him. Howard's 2 sons, Allan and Obed, were born in 1953. They're twins, but are very different. Whilst both are exceptionally smart, Obed is the one seen on the front cover of science magazines and interviewed on television. He's a scientist whose work on the Abcanis is legendary for its implications. Many in the science community reject what he's brought to the table, and that his theories are not only impossible, but dangerous. Obed's diary reveals how much respect he had for Edenshaw and his grandfather, Jeremy, and he was brought into the scientific community by Jeremy when he was 15 and loved exploring the workshop his grandfather had made. But even at that age, he realized that his grandfather's research was heavy. Obed's notes catalogue his growing fear of the work he's engaging in, like Gibson years before, and his final entry is dated in 1991, in which he states that Allan has done something terrible. Allan mostly remains on Shadow Island, undertaking various research, and seems to be interested in continuing the research Richard and Archibald Morton engaged in. He has an almost complete disregard for human life, as shown by the murder of his own father. He respects his grandfather Jeremy, and that seems to be about it. Allan's diary entries are always of a scientific nature and paint him as a cold individual. He's obsessed with his own goals, and that's it. His obsession with getting materials to experiment leads him to shooting the entire crew of a supply ship that brought food to the island, leaving a single survivor you meet briefly in the game. And his darkest moment is captured on Crystal Prism, where you can see his experiments went as far as fusing his father's corpse with DNA from the creatures of darkness, making the horrific hybrid you meet in the game. This leaves things in the balance for the events of the game. Obed living in fear of his brother, Allan's research reaching its pinnacle with him planning to open the gates of darkness with the goal of reuniting the two in twisted genetic experiments, Edenshaw waiting for the day to complete the ritual, and now 2 unknown people are arriving on the island, a private detective and a linguist who for some reason thinks Obed Morton is her father. This may be a bit of a tease to end this early, but I'm afraid that's it. I hope you liked the video. I've done my best to portray events accurately, despite very little help from anything. And thank you very much for watching. I hope to do more videos like this in the future. And thanks for watching.